macOS 10.6 Snow Leopard. This is easily one of the most loved products Apple has ever released. And I'm here to say, it was not the greatest release of macOS. I'm always up for a good debate, and today's topic is certainly going to be one of those. You could be absolutely anywhere else in the world, but instead you're here rocking with me, and I want you to know I appreciate that. Got beats, brews, and a good argument for this YouTube, so let's get into this. I'm not one for big intros. 9to5Mac wrote an article titled, "The Myth, the Legend, How Snow Leopard Became Synonymous with Reliability." The article is a nice attempt to contextualize Snow Leopard in the greater narrative of OS X, but it falls a bit flat. It does make some decent points, and I really don't want to take away from those, but I think I have a better explanation to why Snow Leopard was so dearly loved. Plus, I have my own opinions as to which release of OS X or macOS is the greatest, OS X being the original name of macOS. I think to really make my point, it's best we go back, way back, all the way to the beginning. So here's a brief history of OS X, and I promise I'll keep this short. macOS X started its life with a lot of promise, and not much to show for it. Yes, it was a brand new operating system that was based off the FreeBSD kernel, but 10.0 and 10.1 were slow, buggy, and lacking a lot of the critical software that most users relied on, and the hardware running it didn't do a lot of favors. Native application ports were very few and far between in the early days of OS X. Many of the early applications relied on the Carbon framework, which functioned as an intermediate way to port macOS 9 applications to OS X with less friction rather than doing a full port to Cocoa. And that's assuming that they ran in OS X at all. It wasn't until 10.2 Jaguar that OS X really started to come into its own. And yes, my international friends, I said Jaguar as
Jagwire.
Back in 2002, when the overseas press heard Steve Jobs say Jaguar, it caused a minor international schism. And I only bring this up because I'm going to be saying
Jaguar
too. Jaguar saw the introduction of HFS Plus, MPEG-4, Address Book Bonjour for networking, Quartz Extreme, iCal, and iChat. Quick aside, I just cannot stress what a big deal it was when Apple released Quartz Extreme in 10.2.8 as it used the GPU to accelerate the UI. This was huge as the Aqua interface burned a lot of CPU cycles with live resizing and live dragging of windows. By 2003, 10.3 Panther was the first OS X that I used almost exclusively, as previously I would dual boot between macOS 9 and OS X. My guess is this is a similar experience for many other longtime Mac users. It had less to do with the new features like Font Book, File Vault, Expose, much faster preview, better stability, but rather most major applications had a Cocoa or Carbon version that would run in OS X without having to use classic emulation, and Apple started shifting to OS X only computers like the G5 during this time. Then one of the biggest rumors of all of Apple's history came to fruition. In 2006, 10.4.4 Tiger became the first release of OS X to support x86, starting with the iMac Core Duo. This was on the heels of Tiger, which introduced some of the core technologies that are still with us, like Spotlight replacing Sherlock, 64-bit support, Core Image, and Core Audio. There were also some important improvements like QuickTime 7, and it introduced a strategy we would recognize today, Rosetta, a compatibility layer to translate PowerPC binaries to x86.
It is transparent to users. It's nothing like classic where you're loading a whole operating system. This is totally transparent. You just click on a PowerPC binary, it starts translating.
It really was 10.5 Leopard that brought macOS into the modern era, as it had core animation, boot camp, time machine spaces, full Unix compliance, app sandboxing, and app code signing. The UI was maturing, and the security features were rolling in. However, despite all the significant changes in the previous OSs, 10.6 is the one that hangs above the rest. 10.6 was not devoid of important features. In 2008, it introduced multi-touch support for the trackpads, better boot camp support, improvements to Time Machine, the introduction of Grand Central Dispatch for better multi-core performance, and OpenCL. There was also a much-needed rewrite of many core applications to 64-bit. And while these features are great, these aren't the reasons why people love this damn OS so much. That is because there's one absolutely huge asterisk that I have not mentioned yet and no one seems to remember. Snow Leopard dropped PowerPC support. This was the CPU choice for Apple since 1994. So remember that first Intel iMac, the dual-core Core Duo? That was released on January 10th of 2006. I don't think I'm making this point clearly enough, so let me explain. At its release, the absolute oldest computer that Snow Leopard ever was installed on was 3 years old. The previous iMac G5 was a single-core CPU, whereas the iMac Core Duo was dual-core. This also doesn't begin to cover the performance gap between PowerPC and x86, as it was wide. Secondly, Apple only shipped Core Duo Macs for a period of mere months. The new MacBook lineup shipped with a Core Duo in May, and by November, it already had a new, much faster 64-bit Core 2 Duo. In 2009 alone, Apple had refreshed its MacBook, MacBook Pro, MacBook Air, Mac Mini, iMac, Mac Pro, and the Xserve. Yep, that was the entire lineup back then. Between 2006 to 2010, this was normal. Each year, Apple would refresh its entire lineup, sans a few outliers, like the MacBook Air since that wasn't introduced until 2008, and the Mac Mini and Xserve receiving less frequent updates. But the chances were, if you used Snow Leopard, it was on likely very new hardware. It's pretty easy to see why many Mac users also consider this the high watermark for Apple and the Macintosh platform. It's hard to overstate this, but the perception of Apple during this era was completely different. While Apple was doing very well, it was not the world's richest company yet. In 2008, the iPhone was only a year old, and the iPad was still 2 years out. This is why I argue that a lot of the clout that Snow Leopard still commands has to do with its hardware it was running on. A top-of-the-line quad-core G5 could barely play back 1080p without dropping frames, and then 2 years later, a 2008 Mac Pro could play back multiple streams of 1080p video without dropping a single damn frame. This is the single biggest hardware upgrade I've ever experienced in my time of computing, and this was going from a 2004 dual CPU G5 to a 2008 Mac Pro. Yes, it was a bigger upgrade than going from a 2010 Mac Pro to a M1 Max. This might sound silly today, but even a lowly MacBook could watch HD video. The differences in everyday performance was stark, and the x86 Macs even booted faster. Here's also something for the youngins. It's easy to forget that the OS updates used to cost money to the sweet tune of $129. Snow Leopard reduced its price to $30. I have to give 9to5Mac credit because this next point is a good one. Many users probably went from Tiger, skipping Leopard, and going straight to Snow Leopard. There is a pretty big difference between Snow Leopard and Tiger. But I could also argue there's a bigger difference between 10.2 and 10.4, but that just starts getting in the weeds. This was also during the era when Windows Vista had been driving away users in droves. First impressions always matter, and Snow Leopard was a fantastic one to have, especially coming from the frustrations of the often misaligned Vista. Lastly, as I previously mentioned, Snow Leopard represents a time when Mac was still at the center of the Apple universe. The iPod lineup was still going strong, but tied to iTunes, therefore macOS or Windows. The iPhone 3GS was blowing the minds of consumers, journalists, and pretty much anyone who touched one after the introduction of the App Store, but it was still a tethered experience and required a computer to set it up. The iPhone would not become an untethered experience until iOS 5 in 2011. At the heart of all of it was OS X and iTunes. Also, for many Mac acolytes, their god king Steve Jobs was still alive. Even today, it's a trope to hear Mac users lament, "It wouldn't happen if Steve was still alive." If you spend too much time interacting with the Mac community, you're bound to hear that. Apple's 10.7 and 10.8 weren't total duds, but they had some early woes. 10.7 had a few bizarre installer issues like the CUI error, and 10.8 had the troubling permissions issue that would prevent Time Machine restores, much to the chagrin of troubled users. 10.7 Lion brought many of the mainstays we know today, like autosave, autocorrect emojis, push notifications finally replacing Growler, FaceTime, AirDrop, iCloud, and more multi-touch gestures. However, two of these I'd argue were negatives. The first was the way Apple introduced autosave. It felt confusing and it was dumbed down. 10.7 also had to inherit the iCloud debacle, which added to its buggy perception. macOS 10.8 Mountain Lion lacked many of the features that OS X users were used to seeing in the previous OS releases. Part of this can be chalked up to that macOS was maturing, but also it really felt like Apple was devoting all its resources during this time to iPhone and iOS. This perception wasn't helped when many of the big features for OS X were lifted directly from iOS. Things like Notification Center, Game Center messages, AirPlay mirroring, Gatekeeper, it really felt like more of iOSification of OS X. One of the great ironies here is macOS was actually getting faster. The legendary speed of Snow Leopard doesn't really translate into real-world performance. CNET showed that Lion outperformed Snow Leopard. Oh, you better believe that link is in the description of this video. But now it's time we finally get to talk about the true king of OS X releases, and that is the one and only, severely underrated Mavericks. It was the culmination of both the Lions and the total lack of additional iOSification, focusing strictly on performance. It felt like a hardware upgrade had shipped in the form of a software update, and it was the first macOS that was free. That meant anyone could update to it without paying a damn cent. It didn't feature any radical UI changes beyond the much needed tab finder and the reduction of some of the skeuomorphism found in things like the address book, notepad, and iCal. But it did bring the user interface into a glorious, whole new world of resolution independence, not just for the Retina MacBook owners, but for everybody, including 4K display owners. Big, massive things happened under the hood. Timer coalescing was introduced, a massive win for power saving in the MacBook lines, but much bigger was the virtual memory compression. This is such a big deal, I have to explain it. Virtual memory compression functions by using lossless data compression for anything memory related, RAM, virtual disk swaps, and save states. In short, this means you can make much better use of the RAM you have, and it requires less RAM for daily use, especially in multitasking. This also really speeds up virtual spaces as less disk space is required, thus less transfer times, and less power usage. It also drastically improves performance on multi-core machines, thus yet again, longer battery life. Virtual memory compression is the gift that just keeps on giving. It's also the driving tech behind app napping, which was also introduced in Mavericks. App napping puts apps that are not being used to sleep, so they're not using system resources, which improves performance, and as you might have guessed, also saves battery life. Mavericks also introduced minor features like centralized task scheduling, which made more mindful use of the battery, for example, like not running Spotlight indexing while not plugged into a wall. Ars Technica measured Mavericks with an incredible 3 hours longer battery life on a MacBook over running 10.8. Again, 3 hours. Mavericks also deserves bonus points for being stable from the get-go. After 2 releases that weren't, Mavericks deserves kudos for that. And for my Mac Pro homies, it was the first OS to support more than 96 gigabytes of RAM. So why do I feel so strongly that Mavericks is the best release of macOS? Well, that's because a user didn't have to know a damn thing about any of these changes and just could enjoy them. It was a huge performance boost, it was more stable, it got you better battery life, and it unlocked the world of resolution independence. Everything just gelled with Mavericks. Also again, the upgrade was free. Just like Snow Leopard, a lot of the perception and the legacy has to do with the OS that follows it. Mavericks was bookended by with what I'd consider the worst release of x86 macOS ever, macOS 10.10 Yosemite. It was an absolutely terrible overcorrection on the UI and had one of the most brutal bugs that resulted in the worst networking performance I've ever experienced in a modern OS. At least the networking eventually got fixed, unlike the Johnny I flat UI. After Yosemite is what I would consider a successful string of OS releases. El Capitan, Sierra, High Sierra, Mojave, they were all improvements, one after the other after the other after the other. They also cleared some pretty good technical hurdles, like switching from HFS Plus to APFS, and we finally saw a replacement for OpenGL in the form of Metal. The UI was fixed, the operating system was fairly stable, but what didn't happen during this string was any revolutionary changes. This is a side note, but one of the big problems for macOS gaming is its inability to build up and hit a critical mass for its catalog. Many older titles were ported from Win32 to 32-bit Mac apps. When I start talking about macOS again, just remember this little aside. Windows, after some missteps like Windows 8 and 8.1, radically improved with the release of Windows 10 and gained a lot of ground on macOS. It's not like Windows fixed all its UI issues, like why the fuck are there still 2 control panels? But Microsoft on the same exact hardware was the clear performance winner in Apple over cross-platform benchmarks. The crazy outcome of this meant Windows would outperform macOS on an Apple-made computer. Microsoft also boasts something that Apple is absolutely terrible at, and that is legacy support. Windows 10 and 11 can run via emulation layers apps written for Windows 98. Here's a crazy example. A 2006 Mac Pro is forever locked out of running modern macOS releases. But fear not, it can run Windows 10 and it runs surprisingly well, and it can even be hacked to run Windows 11. Also during this dry time for the Mac, Windows even gained proper Bash and ZHS support via Ubuntu as a virtual layer. Apple continued to drag its feet in some very strange places. It wasn't until very recently that Core Audio front-ended into surround sound into a sane manner. That is, if you can even find any software to use with it. Whereas Windows had this ability for like 20 years. And it wasn't until macOS 11 Big Sur that Apple actually added DRM support to appease the streaming services for higher resolution video, despite iOS having this for years. Meanwhile, Catalina was a step backward with its security overcorrections, dropping 32-bit support, which turned out to be a field burner for ARM support and not nearly enough meaningful updates. In a better world, Apple would have let x86 die with the ability to run 32-bit code. We know where Microsoft would have landed on this because they already have. They have finally stopped developing a 32-bit version of Windows, but have made no moves to drop 32-bit binary support. In fact, the Windows 11 preview on ARM supports Rosetta-like translation layers for both 32 and 64-bit applications. We cannot judge macOS releases in a vacuum, thus we have to call out the narrowing gap between Windows and macOS. Older hardware has the distinct advantage on Windows, and this is through drivers, longer-term API support, and things Apple doesn't quite frankly care about, like developers. Apple does not make it easy on developers with the way it constantly changes requirements, or worse, Apple will actively block releases of a driver like in the case of NVIDIA. Being a Mac user often feels like living in a gated community with an overbearing homeowners association. Before I end on too much of a downer for macOS, Big Sur and Monterey can run seamlessly on x86 and ARM, which is still something that can't be said about Windows 11. Make no mistake, Microsoft is working on its answer. It is only a matter of time before we see serious Windows ARM SoCs. Whatever concerns you have about the hardware, the software transition to Apple Silicon has been nothing short of amazing. Running Big Sur on an M1 did not feel like a first-generation product at all. While Apple has always had its eye on consumers, I really hope Apple remembers to take its professional class of users more seriously in the future. Apple Silicon has been exciting for its raw performance, but offers nothing in the way of user serviceability. As a working professional, I want the best from both Microsoft and Apple. Personally, I feel that I shouldn't have to make a compromise between long-term usability and support versus a superior user experience. And why do I feel this way? Well, we had it in the past. I think that when most people say that Snow Leopard is the best operating system Apple has put out, or when I say it's 10.9 Mavericks, what we're both saying is we really want an Apple focused more on the Mac platform and meets our needs better, not theirs. Also, I'm totally making the case that Mavericks is the better release. I mean, really, guys, it is. Do you need me to list the features again? Because I can, this is my video. The Apple Silicon era has been impressive, albeit imperfect. Without the ability to swap out the parts most likely to die like the RAM or more importantly the SSDs, Apple Silicon is a deeply cynical product meant to be disposable technology destined for the e-waste bins when Apple decides they are no longer willing to support said computers. Apple's long-term support has been spotty, especially during its architecture transitions. The key difference this time is we won't be able to service our machines long after Apple decides to stop supporting them. If planned obsolescence is our gated community's walls, they keep getting closer to our house. Before I close out this video, I need to mention that this video was recorded while macOS Ventura was still in beta and the Apple Silicon transition had not been fully completed. Maybe, as of the point you're watching this video, Apple Silicon looks completely different with the release of the Mac Pro. Or maybe it's still a tightly walled garden. Hey, you made it this far. This is the end of the video. These kind of things take quite a bit of time. The graphics, the animations, the upscaled backgrounds. And on the topic of upscaled backgrounds, I got a little treat for you guys who made it to the end. I went through Snow Leopard 10.6 and got all the abstract and all the nature backgrounds and I upscaled them to 5K. This isn't just AML upscaling. I went through and created layers, did layer masking and did individual sharpening and a little bit of color correction where it needed it. So please check those out. They're on my personal blog. It doesn't have any advertisements on it and it's in the description of this video.
Hey, and thanks for watching.
Jaguar.